This art, it is the devotional art of singing.
Ahmed Ansari is an industry assistant professor at the Integrated Design and Media program at NYU Tandem. He has a PhD in Design Studies from Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's in Interaction Design, and a Bachelor's in Communication Design from the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture. His research interests intersect between design studies and history, philosophy of technology, and critical cultural studies, particularly studies of decolonization and globalization, with an area focus on visual and material culture in the Indian subcontinent. Also, a thank you to Austin Finn, the producer and camera assistant to this project. And now, Ahmed, I'd like to start with my first question for you. In the 21st century, design is rooted in almost every aspect of our lives, both physically and digitally, and has become a very broad field. What attracted you most to this niche of decolonization in design and speculative design?
So this is going to turn into a little bit of a story going back around 12, 13 years ago when I was an undergrad and I was enrolled in a graphic design program, a communication design program. My majors were in graphic design and typography, and I had minors in illustration and video production, film and video production. We used to have, I remember, conversations back in school around the ideas of what a local design education might be. And to give a little bit of background and context, so I did my undergraduate degree in Pakistan. I did my master's and my PhD later in the United States. I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. But in Pakistan, we encountered this question of local Pakistani design education in several ways. So I remember when I was enrolled in school as a student, our undergraduate program was modeled on the Bauhaus, the European German Bauhaus Foundation program. So they model themselves over the Bauhaus curriculum. And so my foundation year, was the kind of foundation year where we were exposed to all of these different kinds of studios that expose you to different ways of working and different materials, working with different kinds of material. It was a very European design education. I'd say almost 80% of the design education that I got as an undergrad, sitting in Karachi, was Western European design education. So for example, our studios largely drew from design principles coming from Europe. My graphic design and typography classes, it was largely Western graphic design and typography. Theory classes too. Out of the 3 years that we took a mandatory art history class, I think there was only one semester where we did non-Western art history. The rest was all the history of Western art. Starting, I think we did when we were doing classical sort of art. Apart from the Greeks, we probably loosely covered the Egyptians and the sort of Mesopotamians. But then, there was a large focus on kind of Greek and Roman art, and then right through the kind of Middle Ages down to the Renaissance, and then through to the kind of modern period. We studied all of the sort of Western art movements, Gothic art and Romanticism and Expressionism and Impressionism and painting and so on and so forth. I think there was only one semester where we actually did kind of Islamic art and architecture, and that was it. And it was the same in our studio courses, where in our studio courses, I think the only exposure that we got to anything that stemmed from historically local heritage and sort of art and design practice was calligraphy. So we were exposed in our typography courses. We used to spend a month, I think we spent a month for 2 or 3 semesters doing calligraphy in Urdu. And I'm not, by all this, I don't mean that the school wasn't trying. There was a kind of motion on behalf of the school to introduce art and design, craft practices, techniques that were very much local. But, regardless of this, the space that occupied was very small. And so when I started my teaching career, we were aware already as students that this was a subject of much debate in the faculty room. Our faculty would have discussions around, well, how can we incorporate more of this and sort of connect the education that our students are getting to kind of local culture. But it was when I became a faculty member that I became involved in these conversations and discussions more directly. And so my first job as a teacher was teaching in a media studies program that had kind of two branches. It was a media and design program actually, but they called it media studies. And so there was, half of our students would do media studies and media production, film, particularly like television, and the other half would do design studies and design production, specifically for the advertising industry. And we'd have these conversations on where can we introduce courses, what kinds of assignments that we could create that kind of build on local art practices, local design practices, engage with kind of like the communities locally more. And then when I came to the United States for my master's, obviously I was exposed to discourses here. And I will say that prior to coming to the United States, this was 2011, which is the first time I came, I had no idea that there was, for example, like research or even like deep theory in design. So in a sense, my time in the United States really kind of expanded my view of what was possible in the kind of field. I already have like a lot of exposure to media theory and like film studies and media and communication theory from my prior job. But design theory is something that I really got into when I came to the United States. And I think what really kind of where I began to put a name to this tension between the education that I'd received in my undergrad and in the United States that was very much Western, and the want to or the drive or the imperative or the quest to develop local forms of education kind of started out of that experience. I think I started to a lot of my experiences in the United States kind of changed me, particularly when I went back. So I was exposed to these ways of working in design where when I went back to Karachi, I found out that those ways were falling short in many senses. So like the traditional kind of human-centered design methods and the kinds of frameworks, the methodologies and the methods themselves, they lacked the kind of depth that would actually allow me to practice design to do design research and practice design sensitively in Karachi. And so I was really very frustrated. And when I went back to Karachi and started teaching again, I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about how do you develop a design education that can empower and enable students to conduct socially and culturally sensitive research here at home. And so that's when I really began to focus and also educate myself on critical cultural theory. That's when I began to read up more so on sort of post-colonial theory. And then later on, just before I left again for the United States to come back here for my PhD, I encountered sort of Latin American decolonial theory. Prior to that, I'd mostly read like South Asian and sort of, post-colonial theory that was mostly being written by South Asians and folks from the Middle East. But I encountered Latin American decolonial theory, and that really kind of spoke to me at the time. And so I began to focus on decolonization as the kind of principal framework through which I then did my PhD. And so that's kind of where I've ended up, and that's where I kind of occupy this territory between the United States and between Pakistan, and think at this kind of like interstitial in-between place, thinking about a lot of my work now, I think, has moved away from strictly thinking from within sort of decolonial and post-colonial theory as frameworks, and has reached out more to also thinking about theories of cosmopolitanism. And, I think the larger questions that I'm now exploring are questions that move between sort of different scales of the local and the global. Also, things in Pakistan have changed very, very rapidly and drastically too. So there's a lot of this is also something that in my practice, especially in my educational consulting practice, like these questions repeatedly keep coming up as I travel back home. We're still having those discussions 10 years later, 13 years later. I'm still having those conversations with folks back home and folks here.
This is a devotional style of singing. So we bring oneness with the soul of the person to the great soul God. So, and just to become such that it become one.
Where does decolonization in design and speculative design fit in our culture today, and what role does technology play in it?
I guess my answer here would build on the previous question. One of the things that's really kind of had a huge influence on my life and just the way I think, my kind of disposition towards things is, coming to the United States was really changed my perspective on a lot of things in the sense that it actually exposed me to lots of other perspectives. And so when I came to the United States, I was, Pittsburgh is a small city, but it's quite cosmopolitan. There's students from all around the world. There's a large white community and an African American community. And because I was kind of interested in questions of culture, here I was also exposed to thinking about race critically, because that's like a key sort of like, for Americans, for folks in the United States, like race is one of the key sort of identifiers, right? One of the key ontologies at work here. And so race was not something that I had thought about before I came to the United States, but I encountered it here and I was read as such. And so that's something that I really began to then focus on. I think that my time in the United States has been very invaluable in the sense that it has opened me up to all of these different perspectives and histories and narratives, as well as these conflicts between the various kinds of polities and communities that the United States is composed of. And I think where Sun Ra comes in for me emerges out of this kind of very cosmopolitan encounter with difference. Sun Ra for me exemplifies a number of things. Firstly, I'm a huge fan of travel. I love encountering people from other places, other societies, other cultures. And so Sun Ra for me stands as still exemplifies that kind of encounter, my encounter with sort of African American culture in the United States. I think the thing that I also find really fascinating about Sun Ra is I was exposed to jazz in the United States. I really enjoy jazz. I listen to a lot of jazz. I enjoy live jazz. And I think like that too, my appreciation of jazz, I see it almost as a kind of gift, like that is the kind of gift that I was given, African American culture gifting me the gift of jazz. And so that kind of cultural opening up, like the expansion of my world culturally, is something that exemplifies itself in the figure of Sun Ra. I particularly enjoy Sun Ra's jazz. And so a lot of this has to do with exposure and the opening up of worldview and, the opening up of my worldview in these kinds of encounters with difference. The other thing is that, I'm also kind of very intellectually, as an academic, as a scholar, I'm very interested in Sun Ra because he also exemplifies a number of other things, right? But he exemplifies the kind of magnificent and magnanimous creativity of the African American diaspora amidst such suffering as they experience in the United States, right? This kind of ingenuity. Sun Ra exemplifies for me the flowering of culture under such conditions, right? The making of things that are beautiful and that lift, Sun Ra was a huge believer in kind of African Americans dreaming and seeing things different, envisioning futures for their own communities outside of what had been bequeathed to them via like white settler colonialism, right? So Sun Ra for me is a character who was telling his people, this need not be your kind of legacy, philosophical, right? You can dream for yourself futures that are antithetical to white supremacy, to sort of settler colonialism, to even to capitalism. So he's a figure. He's a really important figure. He exemplifies that. I also find like his articulations, like he's a character who's about dreaming and about speculation on and then materializing, speculating about African American futures, which is something that I am really interested in the context of my own academic work as a scholar. I'm interested in this phenomenon of cosmotechnicity.
designing
or
is
like the
ontological
idea
design,
that
which is
technological infrastructures are always cosmologically and culturally bound. And
whenever you design
cosmotechnicity
anything,
for me
indirectly you're
has like
designing
a
human,
fundamentally
and the
featural
condition of the
component to
human.
it. It
So,
is
you know,
about
you're
dreaming
designing how
futures
people
other
you're
and dreaming
designing, you're
futures
enabling people
along
to do things
different
differently. By
cultural
doing so, you're
lines.
changing
And so
the way
Sandra again
that they do
exemplifies
things,
this
that they
for me.
interact with the world, that
I'm a
they
really
behave,
kind
and
of
so on and
like
so
I find his idea of myth
And
science
speculation
very
has a role to
interesting
play in
several
that,
different
because,
ways.
you know,
firstly, like the observation that
designers
science is a kind
make,
of, or
think
encourages
about and
scientific
envision
practice, encourages
things,
a
how things could
particular
be
kind of
otherwise.
culture and has its own
And
myth.
Sun
So in
Ra
that
does
way,
that
the
too,
kind of
but
like
in a different
this
realm.
very kind of
He uses
Eurocentric
music,
view of science
and
as
he
this
uses his
neutral
art,
arbiter
because
of
it's
sort
not
of like
just
morally
music,
or
but it's also
a real
the
truth.
performance.
He
the
kind of
performance
dispenses
of
with
a
that,
particular
right? And he
subject,
shows it as just
performance
another
of
myth
a
that
particular
the
identity.
scientific
His
communities
music
and
performances
science
were,
culture has
ostentatious.
created
They were,
around
it's
itself,
also,
right? So there's
pay
an aura
attention to
of
other things like the
mystique,
headdress,
right? Of
for
myth
example.
that
He was
science
using,
cultivates.
he was actually
And in doing so, I
constructing
think Sunra
what
also
a
reveals,
whole
in revealing
mythos,
this about
a
science,
whole
he
kind of,
reveals in a way
mythology.
how
And Sunra
modern
himself has talked
discourses
about
of
this in his
science
work
are
on myth
so
science.
deeply entrenched
So he's
in these very
crafting, he's bringing
Anglo-Eurocentric
together
ways of
technology and sort of like post,
he actually, in
industrial,
doing
sort
so,
of
I think he
quote
does something
unquote
really
high
interesting, which is
technology,
he opens up
and
the
he's kind
possibility
of mixing
of
that
thinking
with
science
mythology
and scientific practice
and
along other
kind of like
lines. There's a
working
really kind of generative
with history
space where I
too,
think,
like engaging
Sunra is
with
trying
this
to
African
appropriate
American
science,
past in
but
order to
towards other
envision the
needs.
futures
He is a big
otherwise,
proponent of
futures
using
different.
science
And that's where I think
scientific
like
and technological
speculation plays
imaginaries
a huge
in this
role.
kind of
I'm
social
really
grouping.
interested.
So he's
in
really kind of asking the question in his
developing
work,
practice
how
of
can the
speculative design
appropriation
that
of
does
quote unquote
this,
Western
and
sort of
teaching designers
Eurocentric
how to do
science,
this.
how can that be
I
appropriated
can
and
say that
subverted and sort of like
speculative
tethered
design
to
as a
other
means
needs
of
and other
decolonization.
goals? And
There's
to
another
and these
term
goals
that I
are,
often
they have
draw
they're
on,
large
which is the
speculative
term
components,
cosmotechnics.
right? They're about
And
imagining
that is
other sciences
basically
and imagining
the idea.
science as
The term,
beholden
the
to other
concept is
sort of
really
like
old.
directives, other
The
than
term is new.
merely
The
promoting
term
its,
comes from this
own,
Chinese
perpetuating its
philosopher,
own
his
kind of culture
contemporaries,
and its own very
around,
narrow
called
vision of
Decoy.
society.
And
So
he has this
kind of
whole
asking, I
argument
think
that
Sunra asks this
modern
question, right?
20th
What are
and
the other
21st
kinds of
century industrial
societies that
technologies
science can
and
enable
infrastructures
that are not like this
therefore our ways of
capitalist,
life,
instrumentalist
modern ways of
society
life,
that we
are
have, like
kind
where
of
everything is
rooted
sort of
in,
subject
obviously
to
there's a
whims
long
and
kind
sort
of
of dynamics of
genealogy.
capital,
So
which
we're
is
looking
why
at the
I think
Industrial
Sunra is an
Revolution,
interesting
and the
kind of
Industrial Revolution
anti-capitalist
emerges in
thinker. That's
Europe,
just one reading
and
of
it has
So,
certain ways
Sunra
of
stands
thinking
for
about,
all of these
say,
different
nature,
things. For me, I think
other,
there's something in
like
Sunra's work
phenomena,
that
other
speaks in a
real
very kind of
phenomena. It has ways
global
of
and
thinking about
cosmopolitan
reality,
manner
about
too, right?
nature,
But so far,
about
I've talked a lot
society,
about how Sunra's
how we
work
build
means a
relationships
lot
with
for
other
his
people
own
that are very like
community and his own
Anglo-European.
people. But I think
So
there
there
is
is
something
really
in the
interesting
nature of his
questions
work that
around, like,
also
well, what would it
speaks
mean
to
to have
other
a
communities
Chinese
and other
philosophy of
people, those of us
technology
who are
that will
trying to
inform the
think beyond
development of
Anglo and
Chinese
Eurocentric.
technology?
And so
Which is
he's been a
question that he
huge kind of
put in
influence
his
on
book
my
called The
thinking.
Question Concerning Technology in China. So I'm really interested in speculation, and because I'm a designer, I'm interested in speculative design, but not speculative design the way that it was originally imagined by folks like Dunn and Raby. So it's a different kind of speculative design from the way that speculative and critical design were originally kind of defined in the field.
I really appreciate that. I have used Dunn and Raby before as a source for many years now, but I think it is very crucial and important that there are other actors and you yourself making inroads to diversifying and broadening the definition of what speculative design is and can be. I wanted to just interject here because another part of the question here in the Sunra room was, and I think you've already kind of addressed it, but I was going to ask, what are the two most important issues in design technologies that need to be addressed? And I'm thinking one that came to mind as you spoke was talking about really designing for the condition of the human. But can you speak a little bit more directly to these two or more, important issues, the human, the multimodal approach of technology mixed with mythology and history? Anything else you want to add to that in terms of important issues?
Yeah, so I certainly think that it's really crucial in design education that we treat design, whenever you're designing anything. And I think, the same can be said of it's not just design too. Obviously architecture, which is a form of design, but I feel like one could say this of the arts as well in a slightly different way. But that design in particular, all designing is designing the human indirectly. And so I think that design education really needs to focus more so on this, like what are we really designing when we're designing apps or interfaces or products or systems or services, etc. I think the other thing, I mean, for the longest time, there had been very little in the way of, at least in the field, of reckoning with and trying to understand the ways in which design has been excluding. It's been exclusive. It's excluded communities, particularly communities of color. It has marginalized communities, and I think a lot of what the decolonial turn has done, a lot of what has happened in the last couple of years, and I'm really happy to see this happen, is that a lot more people are now talking about design, both within the global sense and the local sense, but paying a lot more attention to excluded actors. And it's there's whole histories of marginalization. It's the marginalization of the achievements and contributions of women designers. So for the longest time, like when you read design history and design textbooks, like all you read is like about the contributions of white men, usually middle-aged and pretty well off, like design, white men. And those are the superstars of the design world. And I think what has happened, it's really good that now we're paying a lot more attention to recovering and revitalizing the contributions of women, the contributions of persons of color, the contributions of folks who have been historically excluded. So I think that's another thing that's really important, and more work needs to be done, as always. So I'm really happy that more and more people are also beginning to participate and become included in those conversations.
Yes, I get enthusiastic just listening to you talk about this with so much fervor and also optimism. I think that there's something that is crucial right now. It feels like a very difficult time globally for us, and I think we need more players, more actors engaged in critically examining history, past design principles. And that brings me to another question about this kind of decolonizing design process, where you talk about recovering and revitalizing and really providing platforms for excluded communities and marginalized groups. So that already talks about, how it's differentiated from traditional Western ways of thinking about design, whereas, the superstars are all white men. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of the essence of this process of decolonizing design?
Yeah, so I definitely say that, like when we say, like, for example, that, all designing is the designing of the human condition, it's also true that there is no one singular human condition. There are many different kinds of humans in the world. Every community of people has its own kind of like ways of engaging with reality. I think a large part of the decolonial turn has been in trying to engage with what and how the realities of other people can inform design practice. And this has happened in various ways. Obviously, there's kind of confronting the ways in which marginalized communities experience, say, for example, experience violence, experience marginalization. And I think there's a real imperative in design now to kind of not dismiss their experiences, but actually to kind of engage with them, to involve them as actors, people from marginalized groups as actors within the design process. I think in another sense, and this is largely in the sense of culture, I think, cultural difference or racial difference, I think that there's a real move to re-engage with past history, which is kind of actually what Sun Ra's doing, in his work, right? He is engaging with African American history and the historical as well as present trauma of African Americans, but in order to forge something new, something inventive, something hopeful, something that is visionary, something that gives, basically dreaming a new dream for African Americans. He is creating something that is incredibly optimistic, and quite and very inspiring. So and this has been, Sonra does this in the United States. There is a great deal of literature, artwork, etc., that has been done in other parts of the world and is still being done, where you have artists, designers engaging with elements of their local histories, drawing from those histories, engaging critically with those histories in the present, because obviously culture also changes, over time, and doing really interesting things, I think, with it. Like other examples of like artists who are doing really interesting work that I admire, like Martian Alayari, does this really Iranian, I believe she's of Iranian origin. She does this really interesting work that engages with Islamic sort of history and Islamic sort of like cosmology. And she's doing it with contemporary technologies, So that's, hers is an example of such work. There's a lot of work that is being done by contemporary, like Native American artists, African American artists, and artists from the global South. And that kind of work is also now being done in design in a slightly different way, like imagining what would alternative infrastructures, that look like, what would technological infrastructures, like useful technological infrastructures, look like from within another lens, a non-Western lens.
So I have some more questions for you, and I think that might take us to some of the other rooms. And so my next question is, can you describe the nuances between globalization and, as you mentioned before this term, cosmopolitanism? And you might want to define that for us as well, and I think that might take us to the anime room. Is that correct?
Sure, yeah. So let's see. There it is. Okay.
All right, we're following.
We'll sing up to Sa only, and we'll develop entire raga in this lower octave.
Such a great room. Okay, let me come back down. I flew kind of fast. Okay. So I'm just going to ask you that question again now that we're in the anime room. Can you describe the nuances between globalization and cosmopolitanism?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question. I think certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, I've engaged more with the kinds of academic discourses that focus on cosmopolitanism. Whereas before, I think prior to 2019, I was very squarely focused on discourses of decolonization and, to a certain extent, globalization. I think globalization is something that is framed slightly differently depending on where you're kind of looking at it from. So in sort of decolonial theory, and particularly like Latin American decolonial theory, as well as to some extent post-colonial theory, and theories of development, globalization is read as Anglo-European ways of being in the world being disseminated across and in fact enforced upon the rest of the globe. So decolonial theory has a very kind of heavy critique of globalization as a phenomena that kind of flattens and erases cultural difference in favor of forcing other countries to develop upon Anglo-European dictates, particularly in the 20th century. And, like the United States has been the kind of biggest actor. And so there's a critique of globalization, which is that it, and it goes hand in hand with the idea of development, which has several senses. There's obviously there's technological, infrastructural, material development, ways of, the ways in which cities are organized and urban environments are organized, again, relates to urban planning as a design activity, and architectural forms, South Asia, India had its own sort of particular forms, ways of building that were indigenous to the subcontinent and use local materials and so on and so forth. But with globalization, especially over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, you find that those older ways of building give way to concrete apartment blocks. And there's a whole, that ties to also to, when we're talking about globalization, we can't help but also talk about global capitalism. And so there's the material dimension, there's economic and sort of financial dimensions. Obviously, we have a whole set of international institutions like the World Bank, etc., that kind of dictate to quote unquote underdeveloped countries how they should be developing. And there's post-colonial scholars like Ashish Nandi who have drawn attention to the violence of development. Development and industrialization is something that also uproots communities that have lived very close to the land. There's been ecological destruction and so on and so forth. So there's an ecological critique of globalization. So I could say that one way of thinking about globalization is in this kind of negative sense, in the sense of what has been lost or destroyed in order to globalize. The other sense is at the same time, globalization has also led to obviously greater we live in an incredibly interconnected world. And the flip side of globalization is that it has brought us to a point where, cultures mix and are constantly in dialogue with each other. This is something that I'm also particularly interested in, but it has allowed for new forms of cultural expression as well as new social forms to emerge. I'm a little skeptical also of the idea, there are arguments coming from there are certain theories of capitalism that say that capitalism is actually not a monolithic thing. We can't really consider it as a single monolithic world system, but that actually there are varieties of capitalism across the world, different places, different countries, different contexts, there are all these weird hybrid forms of capitalism. And so you can't really kind of talk about it as a singular thing. But all of this is very contentious, I believe, across, various fields and disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. Cosmopolitanism is my interest in cosmopolitanism. So I am interested in globalization in both of these senses, like both the critique of globalization as well as what globalization has enabled. So I've begun to think about cosmopolitan in relation to decolonization more recently. And I think the reason I take up the issue of cosmopolitanism is, a lot of this came out of my staying in the United States, doing my PhD here and teaching here. So, as a teacher, I have to deal with classrooms that have students from all around the world. So I'm in a cosmopolitan classroom. That's the classroom in the United States. I will also say that it's not true that, I've also taught in Pakistan. And I will say that Pakistani classrooms are also diverse, but in a different way. It's not that there aren't people from other parts of the world. I often say that Karachi is as cosmopolitan as New York, or, it is still a cosmopolitan city. Like my parents, where they live, they have a Chinese, there's a Chinese couple, and I think, the husband's an engineer. There's they're living right down the street. There's a French, there's someone who's French who lives right down the street from them too. So you have, I think we are living in a world that is where societies are becoming, if they weren't already, increasingly more cosmopolitan in terms of, different people living and sharing the same neighborhood, the same space together. But for me, I think the question became really important when I started teaching here, where, a lot of my classes, both at my previous job and at NYU, deal with questions of culture, deal with questions of race, racial, ethnic, and cultural difference. And I'm having to navigate this territory where I have students from all around the world. So I have international students from 10 different countries, and I have African American students, and I have students who, have roots in, I have Latino and Hispanic students. And so I have, so it becomes a real important question, I think, for the educator in how does one deal sensitively and how does one educate in the cosmopolitan classroom and get students to understand that, cross-cultural, cross-racial, and cross-ethnic dialogue is really important. And that's the way I've been thinking. I've become interested in cosmopolitan and thinking about cosmopolitanism because that's part of the reality, that's part of my reality and the reality of many educators. It's also it's a tricky thing to kind of navigate because it's like, you want to give equal weight to everyone in the classroom. And we can talk about this more so. I know that we're going to talk about education in a bit, but it's tough to navigate, talking about these already pretty sensitive and difficult, very complex topics, doing it where you have like 15 different perspectives in the room. How do you have an education that is fair to everyone? So like there's questions of sort of equity and doing justice to all of your students. I've also become interested in cosmopolitanism in a more general sense with regards to like, again, with the question, like designers work with, there's a talk that I'm going to give in a few days that talks about this at great length, but a lot of the work that designers do, particularly when they do design research, is in working with many different communities. So like participatory or co-design practice, for example, you will be working with people right in the room who come from very different backgrounds and may hold very different perspectives on the same things, on the same phenomena. And so how does one navigate and negotiate through that? A lot of that kind of work of mine really is rethinking like methods and methodologies in design and how we do research differently and how does one inform sort of like co-design or participatory design practice differently within a cosmopolitan setting.
I wanted to interject here. I mean, I think you're actually articulating this as you speak, but one thing you were talking about in terms of globalization, that there's the critique of globalization, and then also recognizing what has been enabled, and on some level maybe the cosmopolitan classroom has been enabled by globalization. But how in Western education, which is, you're teaching at New York University, you're teaching in New York City, so how can Western education push us away from globalization and towards cosmopolitanism? I mean, already our classrooms reflect that, but like, as you're saying, we need to represent or provide equity and justice for all of our students. But we can have 15 to 20 different cultural, racial, ethnic heritages and perspectives. So can you dig deeper into kind of how we address it through pedagogy in the classroom?
Yeah, it's still something that I'm working through. It's a hard question.
Very hard question.
I think a lot of, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, and this is also largely, I have these conversations because I do talks and I do a bit of consulting every now and then, but I think I think the wrong way to think about it, and I'll start with that, is to say, teachers often feel overwhelmed by the idea of the cosmopolitan classroom because it's like, oh my God, now I have to educate myself on the history of every single person I have in the classroom. There's no way I can do that. I don't think that's a viable thing. I don't think it's possible for one professor, one teacher in the classroom to know everything about every single student. But I do think there's something to be said about us as educators being able to create this space and turn the classroom into a place where transcultural, transethnic, transracial, like transcategorical dialogues can happen. There's a term that I use for it called dialogues of difference, where, the idea is that through an exposure to difference, to how other people are different from me, but also how they experience the same things in a different way. So, I think that the classroom can become a space for that. And I think that is where the instructor or the teacher or the educator acts as a kind of facilitator, an opener, someone who opens up that kind of space and for that and allows for that dialogue to happen. I think that it's certainly not an easy thing to do. I think there's a lot of reflexivity. I think so there's a couple of things that I think instructors have to enable within the classroom. I think one is this trying to turn the classroom into a space of dialogue. The other is the engendering a kind of critical reflexivity among students, which is, and this requires kind of navigating between those things that I was talking about earlier, which is we're all in the classroom together. We can talk about how we have been marginalized by these systems, by these infrastructures, thereby engaging in that critique. The decolonial theory and post-colonial, the kind of what I call the negative program, like the critiques of our existing, like we're all in the society, we're experiencing things, we're experiencing marginalization. So there's something that we can all kind of speak to, but we're all experiencing it differently. And so there's that navigating between, getting students to hold space for each other. There's a reflexivity that needs to be engendered in the sense of like decentering also one's own experience in favor of listening to others and learning from their experiences. And these are all things that I think make someone a better researcher too. They're all things that I kind of emphasize in the classroom. So there's dialogues, there's kind of reflexivity. I encourage students to really also, when they to think about their own position as interlocutors of their own sort of communities. So I think the way that I often say this is that I'm Pakistani, I'm an immigrant in the United States. I've lived here for 10 years. But I'm not, obviously, like I cannot speak to mine is not the definitive voice, and it shouldn't be taken as such when talking about the immigrant experience. And I'm also certainly not one shouldn't append this idea of I'm an authentic Pakistani speaker. So there's a certain criticality that I need to have towards myself, where I can talk about Pakistan, but it's my particular experience. I think one of the traps that people fall into is appending, just because you are so and so, whatever you have to say will take as the truth. I think there's a certain kind of criticality that one needs to build towards oneself, and also needs to tell others, this is my experience as a Pakistani immigrant in the US or wherever. So there's building that kind of reflexivity in the classroom, there's building dialogue, and then exposure. Because I think the classroom is a place where students need to be exposed. It's the bright side of cosmopolitanism, right? Which is gaining an appreciation for other cultures, and exposing students to other cultures, and exposing them to other ways of thinking about the world and dealing with the world and doing things and creating art and developing design solutions and learning from that. So which is also, again, it's a different sense of dialogue. It's getting them to engage in that kind of, and be interested in other things in the world as well.
Before we leave the anime room, I know we're going to be taking a tour of your entire Wonder Chamber and all its connected rooms, but do you want to talk a little bit about this anime room and how it spoke to you in terms of these ideas of globalization and cosmopolitanism?
Sure. Again, this is a little related to my own. Obviously, I'm an anime and manga nerd, so I geek out on Japanese, pop culture, and it is really old, goes back to my teenage years. But anime is something anime for me was one of my point of engagement with another culture. With Japan. So in a way, for me, the room symbolizes that developing that appreciation for, and that understanding of another place and another people. it's also interesting because one of the first classes that I taught in my very first couple of years of teaching, I was part of this media studies media department, and one of the first classes that I taught was on anime, was using anime and like looking. It was a class on genre, and the genre that I picked was anime because it was something that I was into. So I think it was a cathartic experience for me. But it was precisely that kind of class. I mean, this is something that from when I started teaching has always been like a key part of my courses, which is I always try to expose students to other work that is being done from other places. So that particular anime class, it was really teaching students about genre, and it was teaching them about like both like it was about science fiction as genre, but it had the twist of like, but we're not just going to look at science fiction. We're going to look at science fiction in this global context, and Japan is going to be one of the countries that we're really going to be focusing on. You know, it was about mediums too. It was about anime as medium, as genre. Television. And that's something that had stuck with me in terms of how I teach, I guess. But anime was that class was one of the first classes where I started experimenting with teaching, I guess. So I have fond memories of that.
So again, traditional Western ways of thinking, asymmetrical colonial power relations that still exist in today's contemporary technology. One that gets discussed a lot is biases in AI and machine learning algorithms. But do you want to speak to other aspects of contemporary digital technologies? Because we've always been technological creatures building things to augment our experiences on the planet, but particularly digital and computer technologies. Do you want to speak to how they may be perpetuating asymmetrical power relations?
Yeah, so this I will say that this particular territory, which is I'd say that there's a couple of things going on in terms of like academic discourses, and I'm more plugged into some than others. So in academic discourses across a number of fields, obviously there's design studies, there's the whole there's the STS community, there's a number of fields, there's a growing, I think, interest in fields like technology ethics and particularly AI ethics. And I've been involved in some of those conversations peripherally especially over the last 2 years. I think the form, so there's on the one hand, there's like critiques, there's what I call the negative and positive programs. The negative program is largely like scholars who are engaging in critiques of, for example, like the ways in which data sets, the ways in which algorithmic mediation creates biases and reinforces systemic sort of like injustices, systemic marginalizations, for communities of color, for instance. So there is that. There's a lot of really nice scholars working on that kind of stuff. Like, for example, like Syed Mustafa Ali has been working on this idea of decolonial computing. He is someone that I've kind of worked with. I don't really engage in that kind of work, but I'm aware of it. Maya Indira Ganesh is another colleague of mine, also engages in that kind of critique of AI. So that's the kind of negative program. In the design world, I think there's been a lot of focus on the shape that discourse takes is under the moniker of design justice. Sasha Costanza-Chalk, wrote the book, Design Justice, where she kind of talks about how, she talks about various contexts where like algorithmic mediation actually, further oppresses already kind of racialized groups or other communities like the queer community. The other kind of big, what I call the positive program, which is I think more so where I've been engaged, is not so much critique as thinking beyond, like pointing out the limitations of Anglo and Eurocentric ways of thinking about things like artificial intelligence, and thinking beyond, Eurocentric AI by taking seriously senses of reality that other cultures and other sort of like ethnic and racial groups have. So here I'm thinking of for example, the work that the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence Working Group, like Suzanne Kike, they've been doing a lot of work on rethinking what they're calling indigenous AI. What would, if we started from, they have a certain set of like principles that they've kind of elevated to ethical principles. So they have a set of ethical principles that they've derived from Native American cosmologies that they're using in order to develop a program, to how do you, and asking questions like, how do you develop an AI that builds relationality, that is connected to community? How do we think about AI differently if we're starting from here instead of the usual sort of like Anglo-centric Anglo-centric perspectives? I think that there's some really interesting work. I was very interested in AI and robotics, like the intersection of those two fields, largely because I studied Heidegger in my master's, and I became aware of the kind of like embodied, critiques by Heideggerian scholars like Hubert Dreyfus, who were saying, who were talking about how like AI as it is a program that's kind of is an academic project that's doomed to failure. You can't really have something that thinks like a human without having a body and the capacity to sense. So I think there's some work that I've done on thinking about embodiment and thinking about different senses of the body that has links. I've certainly linked it to those discourses around embodiment in the AI world. There's a paper that I published in the journal Soma Technics on like Native American ideas of the body and personhood, and the implications for those on how to go about thinking about like embodied technologies differently. So I've been more interested in those kinds of things, in how does another community's sort of perspective on reality allow us to think differently, about modern technologies today.
Sure. I mean, oh my gosh, I'm just so amazed by all of the different people that you cited, and we'll be sure to add links when we post this to the YouTube channel so that all of these scholars that you have referenced, people can link back to and learn more about their research and their work. But particularly your interest in AI and robotics and this idea of embodiment and the capacity to sense, like if we're really going to be creating other intelligences, as I refer to them, and expecting some kind of human condition if they're not embodied, how is that possible? As you pose it, and also I just find it so fascinating, this idea of the indigenous AI and really redirecting the vector of this research towards new cosmology. So just fascinating stuff that you have just shared with us. Thank you. Getting back to your own roots, would you like to share with us something about South Asian design curricula or speculative design curricula, or what you've brought to the table? How that differs from traditional Western design curricula, or how it's beginning through the work of you and others?
Sure, yeah. Just to the last point, to the last question, there was one thing I think I maybe just to give a little bit more detail and clarification on, like my own work on embodiment. I think that, and this is kind of also a plug for, why designers and artists should be reading from maybe like anthropology, because a lot of my own work draws, like where I talk about different kinds of bodies and having different kinds of bodies and different ideas of personhood. A lot of that draws on like cultural anthropology literature. Like there's this really, I think the Soma Techniques piece I wrote, I was drawing really heavily from the work of Felipe de Scola, and there's anthropologists like Viveiros de Castro, like Latin American anthropologists who work within what they call the ontological trend in anthropology. So like one of the really interesting things is we tend to think about what, just to give you an example of what I mean by a different AI, like the one of the core assumptions that computer scientists, like modern Western academic disciplines have that work on this kind of stuff is this idea that beings are dissimilar in terms of their interiority. So like different subjectivities, and this is what de Scola calls like a core to European cosmology, European thinking. where he talks about how like naturalism as a type of cosmology places a lot of emphasis on minds being different. And so the program in AI becomes, how do you develop a mind that thinks similarly to the way that I think? So there's this idea that physically, in terms of the body itself, we all have the same bodily capacities, but we have different subjectivities. And so there's a lot of that informs the way that we think about developing AI now. Whereas if you look at other, like for example, if you look at animist cultures believe in the opposite, that in fact minds are all similar and mental categories are all similar regardless of whether you're human or animal or plant or whatever, right? So the jaguar has the same ideas about social relations that humans have, or trees have the same kind of like, they have the same kinds of mental categories and constructs and the same symbolic categories and constructs, therefore. So they have language in a way, the way that humans do. It's just that their bodies are dissimilar. Their bodies are what, so they have different appetites in other words, because their sensory, their senses are different, the ways in which they sense the world and perceive it is different. But they have similar inner lives. And that animist perspective is a completely different way of thinking about mind and body and personhood. In animist cosmologies, everyone is a person. Trees are people and animals are people, and of course. So there's that's just an example of this kind of like thinking. I think it's interesting stuff, just to think about.
I'm so glad that you brought that onto the table too. I really appreciate that you dug in deeper in terms of your own research and these assumptions that have been made in terms of naturalism as a typical type of cosmology, and then bringing into conversation animist culture and just a completely different, and to many of us, alien point of view. And that's why these conversations and the research you're doing is so important in introducing Western audiences and all audiences new points of reflection, new prisms through which to look at all of these ideas that we might have just kind of respond to in a received knowledge kind of way, otherwise by our core conditioning. I'm just so fascinated and perplexed by it, and enthusiastic too, and everything that you're sharing with us today. Is there anything else you want to speak of in terms of this point that we're just traversing about hardware technology? Or do you want to talk a little bit more about comparing and contrasting design curricula?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, I will say, I really think that, this is the kind of stuff that really excites me. It's the kind of stuff that I want to get students to get excited about.
Yeah.
It also like clarifies, at least for me, like the link between, this is why, like, I really am a big believer in like reading. Like, I love to read. I like reading theory. I try to make this theory link to design. So, I tell students like, you should read about all kinds of like different, read up on different cosmologies, because that'll help you think, differently about how to redesign things today. So it's certainly like something that I emphasize in the classroom. As far as, so South Asian design curricula and Western design curricula. So I will say, as part of my consulting work, I've over the past couple of years, I've been working with design schools to set up programs in Pakistan. And again, this has come up where I think that, there's again, like it's a negotiation between two things. So on the one hand, I think, and the programs I've been involved with, I will say, have been programs that are focusing on UX design, user experience, interaction design, service design. For the longest time, Pakistan did not have these programs. They came very late. And so I think most of my work there has been trying to navigate and negotiate between, we're trying to set up these new programs and formally train designers in these disciplines that are also relatively new in the Pakistani design context. And therefore, you want to expose Pakistani students to the discourses and ways of working and design practices in the West. Like, so there's a certain amount of rigor in the education that I'm trying to build that exposes them globally. Obviously, there has been a lot that's been written about UX design and interface design and interaction design in America and Europe, coming from America and Europe. But that also, there's a balance where we're also asking the question, what is UX design in Pakistan? Like, obviously, there are limits to, like what would it mean to have a local UX design program? What would UX theory be like within the Pakistani context? What are the nuances of the local context? Pakistani context is very different in terms of like what it requires or what it needs than, like I was having this conversation just in June. I always go, I try and visit my home country as much as possible, and there was this really interesting conversation where there was a whole gathering of people, professional designers, design students, and we were talking about how like Pakistan's needs are different from, let's say, the United States. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was this observation that because that we're trying, a lot of designers in Pakistan are trying to fill in gaps, infrastructural gaps. So the places where you find UX design being done is largely to respond to things that there is no public infrastructure for. Whereas in Europe or the United States or, Western societies in general, I think that there is a lot of public infrastructure that exists, that doesn't exist there. Like basic things, even basic things like access to clean water, drinking water, etc., or transportation. And there are obviously then there are cultural nuances too. There are different social structures at play. So design students need to kind of understand the kind of local social and cultural milieu. And that's not something you get from a Western design education. So a lot of my work there with design programs has been trying to find this balance, right? Like we want to teach them like, you want them to read like the literature on affordances. And so they read like Gibson and Norman and, all the folks who've written about affordances. You read the affordances literature, which is largely coming out of the European and American context. But at the same time, then you want to encourage students there to think about, well, okay, can we think about affordances in this kind of South Asian or the more specifically the Pakistani context? Are there things about affordances that are different here? On the subject of affordances, like for example, and this is kind of my own take on it, like I think that there's some really interesting questions to ask about like social practices with regards to affordances and the role of culture in mediating what one sees as an affordance. Another example is like social practice theory. There's a lot it's important to design research. So designers try and when they're doing ethnography, when they're doing qualitative research, they're kind of studying how people do things, like the kinds of social practices that they engage in. And I think that there's some really interesting questions. Like there hasn't been a lot written in Western design about social practices that are non-functional or instrumental, like for example, rituals. Whereas, the majority of Pakistan's population is Muslim. And so there are all these interesting questions that students over there raise and faculty raise around religion and ritual and practices in a religious context, like religious practices, etc. But I don't read much of that here.
Fantastic. I have some other questions that have arisen as you were talking, just in terms of this entire conversation we've been having, where you have been illuminating in a very accessible way. Capitalism isn't this monolithic thing, but we do live in an increasingly globalized society, and so there is both globalization as a positive and a negative force on and within culture. There's the cosmopolitanism classroom, both in New York but also in Pakistan. There's the design for kind of a global human perspective, but then there still has to be this attention paid to the local, at the really like city or town level. So it's just so much to take in and so much to parse as an educator, as a theorist, and I just find it really profound. The amount of time and thought you had put into this elicits what I've just said, although it really didn't shape into a question after all. And I know we've been talking for well over an hour, so actually I will end my questions here. I think more can be teased out through our taking a tour of the space, where you can add anything else to the description of this place, because this is a wonder chamber. It's my intention to produce a virtual decolonized wwwunderchamber. Of course, we know the history of the Wonder Camera, the Cabinet of Curiosities, as a precursor to museums, but also its colonialist history. And so I've been attempting to, with Austin and other people who've been collaborating and participating in this project, to create spaces where people from diverse positionalities and backgrounds can produce experiences and preserve them in a digital realm. Objects and things that are meaningful to them, things that they need to preserve or that they think we need to preserve as a culture. So that's just my introduction to your tour, and then we'd just like to follow you, Ahmed, and let you talk more in depth about these experiences and why you have designed them in this way.
Yeah, so I'd spoken a little bit, I think, about the anime and the Sunrow rooms, but this room, so the statue of Quetzalcoatl, I guess I can speak a little bit to this. So Quetzalcoatl was a goddess. She is associated with the Nahuatl or the Aztecs, although there's differences. All of these terms actually historically stand for different categories of groups: Aztec, Mexican, and Nahuatl. But she belonged to the kind of cosmology and mythology and belief systems of the peoples who now inhabit, of present-day Mexico. And the reason why I put her here is one of the things, especially over the last couple of years, there's a point where I became really interested. I was reading up on kind of Latin American philosophy. A lot of what I do in my own work is reading across cultures. So I do a fair bit of reading from different parts of the world. I was educating myself on sort of Mexican philosophy. There's some great books that have been written on Mexican philosophy, and particularly on Aztec sort of, religion wouldn't be the right word, but systems of belief. And one of the things that really kind of struck me was, this is late 19th century to early to mid 20th century. There are all of these scholars, intellectuals, philosophers in Mexico at the time. And they're really engaging in this project of trying to reread and rethink their relationship with the pre-colonial past, and trying to do the work of navigating between, we have this pre-colonial heritage, and Quetzalcoatl is a symbol of that heritage. And then we have, Spanish colonialism, and now we're sitting here in the 20th century and we're moderns. And one of the philosophers whose work really kind of I would say spoke to me was this philosopher Edmundo O'Gorman. And Edmundo O'Gorman, he's a philosopher who writes about art. So he's written this essay called Art is Monstrosity, and he's thinking in that piece, he kind of starts, in the piece, he talks about how he's standing in a museum and he's looking at a statue of this Mexican goddess. She was a goddess who was associated with, she was a fertility goddess. She was also associated with, I believe, sickness and illness. So there's this interesting kind of play between life and death in her figure. And he's standing there and he says, I'm looking at this goddess Quetzalcoatl, and I'm trying to make sense of what my relationship to the statue should be, right? It's in a museum, it's treated as this art piece. What is my relation to my past as someone who is a product of colonialism, right? I'm a post-colonial subject. And there is, he's asking himself all these really hard questions, what is my relationship as a 20th century Mexican to the Aztecs and to that particular pre-colonial heritage? And he has some really interesting things to say about the interpretation of art and the making sense of art, and of things that have now become pieces that probably had a different purpose to serve in pre-colonial times in that culture, but now are found in museums and galleries and so on and so forth. So he really thinks about, he begins to do this comparison, which is again something that I also do in my methodology, in the way that I work, where he he begins to compare the statue of Kotlekue to Greek statues. So he says, okay, so we're looking at European heritage. We're looking at the ancient, when we think about art in the Western tradition, we're thinking about ancient Greece. We're thinking about the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is also looking back to classical Greece. And he starts with the statues. He's thinking about the statues in sort of classical Greece and Rome. And he talks about how like these statues have this kind of, perfect, the perfect anthropomorphic human, the perfect human. So it's all about sort of like recreating this image of the human, whereas these statues are chimerical. So he's, Kotlekue is, it couldn't be further removed. It's a completely alien thing. It couldn't be further removed from the Greek statues. And he philosophizes about how, in contemplating as a Mexican the heritage of pre-colonial Mexico and putting that into conversation with the other sort of heritage of European art, he comes to this realization that like what is, that there's this idea of monstrousness that sort of like pre-colonial Mexican, if we were to take pre-colonial artifacts like the statue, like it gets us to think about art differently, like to think about art in terms of the monstrous as that which defies any kind of like humanizing, and so he does this really interesting, there's these really interesting plays between like the monstrous and the perfection that, I thought were really kind of helpful in getting me to think about, both as method, like he's putting these two forms of artwork into dialogue with each other and really rethinking like what Western art means, what Mexican art means.
Again, we will add a link. I'll make sure to include in the notes for this segment the various people you've referenced and this whole idea of art as a monstrosity and the chimerical and the symbolic, which we've actually seen in some earlier forms like medieval art of the West, but then it is lost at the dawning of the Renaissance in this attempt yet again to depict anthropomorphic human embodiments tracing back to the Greeks and then the Romans. And so, exploring the monstrous, exploring the chimera and why that emerges in these colonized cultures as well. I mean, I just find this really fascinating course of thought. One other question while we're here that comes to mind in terms of your research and your practice: exposing and addressing the history of colonization in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, of kind of domination of Caucasian culture, particularly the rich white male. What also has happened is hand in hand with colonization, there has been appropriation. When we think about collections, we think about the Wunderchamber, we think about the museum, how many of these colonized cultures who were raped and pillaged, they were either assimilated or their works were appropriated and put in these collections. In terms of your own research, when you are introducing to your students elements or mythologies of other cultures or cosmologies, how careful are you that you are not co-opting another culture in any form and explaining, there's that fine line of walking and exploring and introducing students to these concepts of other cultures and their constructions, but not co-opting them or appropriating from them?
No, it's a great question. It's something, as with all things, this requires like sensitivity.
Right.
So there's a couple of things I think that I try for myself, and I also tell students that there's fine. So I'll say a couple of things. I also I tell students, Europe is also not monolithic. Like one has to, like I've had white students in my classes too, and I always have to tell them like we shouldn't be treating it's unfair to treat Europe as a single monolithic entity when there's actually a lot of diversity. And I think actually like white supremacy culture erases that sort of like difference within Europe in favor of a monolithic white identity. So there's that, just one qualifier. I think the thing that I tell students, and this is something that I have thought about a great deal, there's folks who've talked about this too. Appropriation happens when there is an intent to either harm or benefit exponentially using your privilege. Like appropriation is a form of it's expropriation, right? It's taking from someone else in order to benefit yourself using your own privilege, and or you are intentionally harming someone else indirectly or directly through a representation by appropriating. So there's many different ways to appropriate, I think. And obviously it's wrong to do that. Like, for example, appropriating someone else's, like cultural aesthetics or artifacts, etc., with an intent to profit off of that.
Yes, I will interject here once more. This too becomes a bit of a slippery slope in the arts because there's an entire movement that emerged in the 80s, and perhaps we could trace it all the way back to Dada, with the ready-made, but in the 80s there was a feminist artist in particular, Sherry Levine, who started appropriating from the Western male-dominated canon, and basically rephotographing famous works of art in the canon, and this took on the moniker of appropriation art. From that positionality, one could champion her for pointing out that, these collections across the world at the time only consisted of, or primarily consisted of, white male artists, even throughout the 20th century. So in those terms, appropriation is lending agency to someone who has not had agency before. Someone else I think of is Kahin Wiley, who makes these paintings in the Western tradition. So he's appropriating again from this Western canon, but he's inserting it into members of the Black community, members or actors in these paintings, or portraits of people from his own culture.
Yes, I'm not. So that's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with this history. Thank you for that. I should look into this more. I think most of my thinking is informed from a slightly, because it's largely like research. I do think that, again, whether one is appropriating or not is something that is context specific.
So it is really context specific, and I think it's also something that's used, a term that's used in comedy a lot. It's punching down or punching up, right? If you're punching down with your appropriation as you've defined it, if you're causing harm to someone else by using your own privilege and punching down and appropriating from them, that is an injustice.
Yeah. Whereas I think, like, if it's someone who is in a, who lacks privilege, like punching up,
right,
I think that's again, one has to look at more specifically at context, but I think that's generally, if you're punching up in order to comment on sort of systemic injustice or inequity, then that's not appropriation. But that's something that, again, like, you have to be sensitive to who is doing it, for whom, who are you representing, who does your artworks, like, then it becomes like an I think, and this is something where, like, I think students have to, again, it's something that you have to educate students to be sensitive to. So I think that there's a role that art and design education has to play in sensitizing students to paying attention to the nuances of context so that they're not appropriating.
I'm so glad that you emphasize sensitivity and compassion. I think now more than ever, after living through this pandemic, we need to instill compassion in our classrooms and in our own behaviors more than ever. But one thing I want to be sensitive to right now is your time, Ahmed. We've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes. Are you doing okay with time? Do we have time to go back and revisit some of the other rooms? Or do you think you've already kind of covered things here?
I think, I mean, I think I said pretty much, all three rooms kind of are sort of linked to things that are personal to me. There are things that have personally shaped me, my teaching, my pedagogy, and my thinking. In similar ways. Like, I think, in a sense, if we take all three together, Sun Ra and sort of like African American art and creative expression, musical expression, I think that Japanese pop culture, anime, and the sort of like the philosophy of art, like Mexican theory of art, all three of these are kind of, I think, representative of my own engagements with difference. Right? It's me reaching outside of South Asia and engaging with other cultures, East Asian, African American and Latin American, to kind of, and I think that all of these engagements have really done, they've transformed me. They've really kind of changed the way I think. They've, I've grown to appreciate the richness and the diversity and the plurality of the world. So I hope that the three rooms kind of represent that.
I think they do, and it has been such a great pleasure to talk with you today and more to listen to you and learn from you. I thank you again for your generosity in coming here today for this interview, and it has been a pleasure. I don't want to speak for Austin, but Austin and I have had many conversations about the space, and again, I feel like what happens in these virtual spaces, on these virtual platforms, is we start with spaces, but then we transform them into places through conversations like this, through building places that are specific to one's or a group's cultural identity, stretching in terms of embracing other cultures and believing wholeheartedly in this cause for the good of the future of the world. And then generic spaces become communities, and they become places that have heritages and histories, and I think we need to kind of build more of these and insert these principles in more virtual and social virtual experiences across the world. And I'm so happy to collaborate with you, and I hope you are pleased with the work that we have done in trying to kind of embody some of your thoughts about a contemporary decolonized wonder chamber.
Thank you guys for having me, and I really I like the wonder. I think this is fantastic, Carla, and I really like to thank you for having me and for doing all this work. I think it's a great project in general, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.